The dusty wind of Wyoming seemed to carry the weight of an era with it, a relentless force shaping the barren landscape and the souls who dared to inhabit it. For Ethan Callahan, the telegram he received was an unexpected gust, tearing the quiet fabric of his predictable life. Your uncle, Arthur Callahan, has passed. You are his sole heir, must come to Cheyenne. Ethan, a man in his late 20s, had only fleeting memories of his Uncle Arthur, a distant figure whispered about in family gatherings as a recluse with an eccentric love for the wildlands. Arthur's ranch, the Last Wind, was more of a legend than a place to Ethan, a mythical corner of the world where his uncle had chosen to live out his days in solitude. Ethan's journey was a collision of past and present. Leaving behind the fledgling urban life he had built in Denver, he boarded a train that chugged him toward a destiny he never envisioned. The landscape outside the window transformed from the familiar cityscapes to an endless canvas of golden fields, rugged mountains, and a sky so vast it felt like a living entity. The change was not just in the scenery, but in the air itself, thinner, cleaner, carrying the scent of sagebrush and an untamed freedom. Upon arrival in Cheyenne, he was met by a lawyer, a man named Sterling, whose formal attire seemed out of place in the frontier town. Sterling, with a grave expression, led him to his office, a small room filled with legal books and the smell of old paper. "Mr. Callahan," Sterling began, his voice dry as the dust outside, "your uncle's will is unique. He left everything to you, the ranch, the cattle, everything. But there is a condition." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. A condition. The lawyer pushed a document across the desk. Ethan's eyes scanned the ornate cursive. "To fulfill your inheritance, you must marry within 6 months of his passing. The woman's name is in the will, Eleanor Vance. Your uncle has stipulated that she is to be your bride. If you do not, the ranch will be sold and the proceeds will be donated to a trust for the protection of wildlife." Ethan's world spun. The words were a nonsensical riddle, a cruel joke. He barely knew Arthur, and now he was being forced into a marriage with a complete stranger. "Who is she?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "A young widow," Sterling explained. "Her husband was a ranch hand on your uncle's property. He died in an accident last year. Your uncle felt a great deal of responsibility for her well-being. He was a very traditional man, Mr. Callahan. He believed a woman should be cared for." The words felt like a cold shower. Ethan couldn't comprehend his uncle's archaic sense of duty. He felt a wave of anger and frustration. He was being strong-armed into a life he didn't want, all for a ranch he never asked for. He left the office with the will clutched in his hand, the weight of the paper feeling heavier than any burden he had ever carried. He spent the night in a small, rough-hewn hotel room, the unfamiliar quiet of the night pressing in on him. He considered his options. He could walk away, return to Denver, and forget this strange inheritance. But something held him back. The ranch was his family's legacy, a piece of his bloodline he never knew he had. The challenge, the sheer audacity of the demand, sparked a defiant curiosity within him. He had to see this through, if only to understand the man his uncle was and the woman he was expected to marry. The next morning he rented a horse and a rickety wagon, his eyes set on a distant horizon where the land met the sky, a horizon that marked the location of the Last Wind. The journey to the Last Wind was a test of endurance and resolve. The roads were little more than dusty trails, and the landscape was a monotonous panorama of brown and gold. Ethan navigated by a fading map Sterling had given him, a crumpled piece of paper that felt as old as the ranch itself. After 2 days of relentless travel, the ranch finally emerged from the haze, a cluster of buildings perched on a slight rise, looking both worn and defiant against the vast sky. The main house was a 2-story structure of weathered wood, its porch sagging and its windows looking like empty eyes. The barn stood nearby, a stoic sentinel against the wind, and a corral sat empty, its fence rails splintered. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the neigh of his horse. The place felt abandoned, a ghost ranch. As he approached the porch, the front door swung open and a figure appeared. It was a woman, her face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. She held a rifle in her hands, its polished steel glinting in the afternoon sun. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice low and steady, without a hint of fear. "I'm Ethan Callahan," he replied, raising his hand slowly. "Arthur Callahan was my uncle." The woman lowered the rifle, but her eyes, a striking shade of green, remained fixed on him, searching, evaluating. She was younger than he expected, no more than 25, with a face that was both strong and beautiful, etched with the fine lines of someone who had seen too much for their age. Her hands, calloused and strong, held the rifle with a natural ease. "I'm Eleanor Vance," she said, her voice softer now, but still cautious. "I was expecting you." He felt a jolt of recognition. This was the woman from the will, the one his uncle had written into his life. She was not what he had imagined, a delicate lady in distress. She was a woman of the West, tough and self-sufficient. "Sterling sent me the will," he said, the words feeling foreign and awkward in the dusty air. Eleanor nodded, a hint of a bitter smile on her lips. "He was a strange man, your uncle. He believed in providing for those he cared about. His way was unconventional." Eleanor led him inside. The house was clean but sparse, filled with a sense of lingering loss. She showed him around, pointing out the kitchen, the living room, and the upstairs bedrooms. There was a sense of order to her movements, a quiet efficiency that spoke of long-practiced routine. "Your uncle's room is upstairs," she said, her voice flat. "I've been taking care of the place since..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Ethan understood. Since her husband's death, since Arthur's death. She was a woman of few words, and those she used were direct and to the point. He saw the strain in her eyes, the weary set of her shoulders. She was holding the world on her own. He realized that the ranch's desolate state wasn't due to neglect, but to a lack of resources, a lack of hands. "The cattle are still here," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "I've managed to keep them fed and watered, but they need a proper drive to market soon. We're running low on supplies. We need a new fence. The wolves are getting bolder." The word "we" hung in the air, a silent question. They were bound by the will, two strangers forced into a partnership. Ethan felt a flicker of something new, a sense of shared responsibility. This was more than a strange legal document. This was a place, a life, and a woman that his uncle had entrusted him with. That night, as the stars blazed in the impossibly dark sky, Ethan sat on the porch, watching the vast expanse. He felt a deep sense of disorientation. He was no longer the man from Denver. He was a rancher now, with a silent house, a weary partner, and a legacy that was both a burden and a strange new calling. The first few days at the last wind were a baptism by fire. Ethan, who had spent his life in the city, was clumsy and slow. He struggled with mending fences, his hands blistered and sore. He fumbled with the saddle and was nearly bucked off by a stubborn horse named Rusty. Eleanor, on the other hand, was a force of nature. She moved with a purpose, her every action efficient and skilled. She rode with a grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle, her movements synchronized with the rhythm of the land. She was patient with him, but her patience was quiet, a steady expectation rather than a vocal reassurance. One afternoon, he found her struggling to lift a heavy bale of hay. He rushed to help, his muscles straining as he lifted his end. They worked in tandem, their bodies moving in a new, unspoken rhythm. When the bale was in place, they stood for a moment, the silence between them less awkward than before. "You're not from here," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "No," he replied. "I grew up near Boston, but I've been in Denver for a while. I was working as a clerk." She simply nodded, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of an old, buried pain. He wondered about her life, about the husband she had lost, about her connection to his uncle. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "My whole life," she replied. "My husband, David, was Arthur's foreman. We lived in the cabin by the creek. After he died, Arthur asked me to stay, to help." Her voice was thick with unspoken emotion, and Ethan felt a deep sympathy for her. He realized that this place wasn't just his inheritance, it was her home, a place filled with both love and loss. He began to see the ranch through her eyes. The worn-out barn was not just a structure, it was a place of work and refuge. The vast pasture was not just empty land, it was the lifeblood of their cattle. The quiet was not just silence, it was a deep, abiding peace. Their alliance, born of a bizarre will, began to feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like a collaboration. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their conversations limited to the tasks at hand. "The fence needs mending. The mare is limping. We're out of coffee." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Ethan found Eleanor sitting on the porch, a worn-out book in her hands. He sat beside her, a respectful distance between them. "This was David's," she said, holding up the book. "He loved stories of the West. He was a good man, Ethan, a good husband." Her voice trembled slightly, and for the first time, Ethan saw the raw grief that lay beneath her stoic exterior. He didn't know what to say. He simply sat there, a silent companion in her sorrow. "Arthur believed in a different kind of strength," she said, breaking the silence. "He said that a man's strength wasn't just in his hands, but in his heart. He saw that David was a kind man, and he saw that I was alone." Ethan realized that his uncle's will wasn't a cruel joke. It was a final act of a man who saw two people in need of a life, a woman who had lost her husband and a young man who had lost his way. He wasn't just inheriting land, he was inheriting a responsibility, a life, a purpose. The first major challenge came with a cold snap that descended upon the valley. The wind howled like a hungry animal, and the temperature dropped, turning the muddy ground into an icy sheet. The cattle, restless and cold, bunched together for warmth. One morning, Ethan and Eleanor discovered a young calf, its leg gored by a wild animal. The wound was deep, and the calf was shivering, its eyes wide with fear. "A wolf," Eleanor said, her voice a quiet diagnosis. "We need to get it to the barn. We can't leave it out here." They worked together, Eleanor with her calm, knowing hands, and Ethan with his clumsy strength. They carried the calf to the barn, its tiny weight a heavy burden. Eleanor cleaned the wound with whiskey and a clean rag, her movements gentle and sure. Ethan, watching her, was struck by her quiet compassion. This was not a woman who just worked the land. She was a woman who was a part of it, who cared for its creatures. As the days passed, Ethan took on the role of the calf's primary caretaker. He learned to mix feed, to clean the wound, to sit with the shivering animal, offering the warmth of his hands. He named the calf Braveheart, and as the little animal slowly began to recover, a different kind of bond formed between him and Eleanor. Their conversations were no longer limited to chores. They talked about the land, the sky, the history of the ranch. "My dad always told me stories about the Callahan Ranch," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars. He said it was a place of true grit and independence. He never talked about Uncle Arthur much, though. "Your uncle was a man of his word," Eleanor said. "He was a quiet man, but he was always there. He was a good neighbor and a good friend. He took care of me after David died. He didn't have to." The trust between them deepened. They were no longer two strangers bound by a will, but two people sharing a life, two people who found solace in the quiet routine of the ranch. One afternoon, they were mending a fence near the creek when they heard a child scream. They rushed toward the sound, their hearts pounding. They found a young boy, no older than 10, his leg caught in a rusted trap, his face a mask of pain and terror. "It's Billy," Eleanor said, her voice laced with concern. "He's from the Jensen farm down the road. His family just moved here. Ethan and Eleanor worked together, their movements swift and coordinated. Ethan used a crowbar to pry open the trap, while Eleanor, with her gentle voice and calm hands, soothed the boy. "It's all right, Billy," she whispered. "We're going to get you out." The boy, terrified, clung to her. He didn't know Ethan, but he trusted Eleanor implicitly. They freed the boy and carried him back to the ranch house. Eleanor cleaned his wound, and Ethan wrapped his leg in a clean bandage. They gave him a warm bowl of soup, and he sat by the fire, shivering but safe. When Billy's father arrived, his face a mix of fear and relief, he looked at Ethan and Eleanor with a new kind of respect. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my son. I owe you both." "Just glad we were there," Ethan said, a warmth spreading through his chest. He wasn't a city clerk anymore. He was a rancher, a caretaker, a part of this land, a part of this community. The calm was short-lived. A few days later, a man named Silas Reed showed up at the ranch. He was a tall, imposing figure with a hard face and a predatory gleam in his eyes. He introduced himself as the nephew of Arthur's late neighbor, a man who had died a year before. "I've come to claim what's mine," he said, his voice a low growl. "My uncle had a verbal agreement with Arthur to buy this part of the ranch. I've come to close the deal." Ethan felt a surge of anger. "This ranch belongs to me," he said, his voice steady. "My uncle's will is clear. There was no deal." Silas sneered. "A verbal agreement is as good as a contract out here, boy. We're not in the city. You get off my land, or you'll regret it." The threat was clear. Silas, a man who believed in force over law, was not going to be reasoned with. Eleanor, standing at Ethan's side, spoke up. "Arthur never mentioned any agreement, Mr. Reed. He was an honest man." Silas ignored her, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "You have 2 days to pack up and get out, or you'll be facing a fight you can't win." Ethan, feeling the weight of the ranch and Eleanor's well-being on his shoulders, knew he couldn't back down. He was no longer just a man from Denver. He was a Callahan, and this was his land. "This is our ranch, Silas," he said, the words surprising even himself. "We're not going anywhere." Silas simply smiled, a cold, humorless expression. "We'll see about that." The 2 days passed in a tense, nerve-wracking silence. Ethan and Eleanor prepared for the inevitable confrontation, their bond strengthening in the face of the threat. They worked together, securing the livestock, checking their supplies, a silent understanding passing between them. The day came and Silas arrived, not alone, but with 2 other men, their faces as hard as his. "This is your last chance," Silas said. "Get out." Ethan, standing tall in front of the house, held his ground. "This is our home." The confrontation escalated. A scuffle broke out, and Ethan, outmatched by the 3 men, was knocked to the ground. Just as Silas raised his fist to strike him, a rifle shot rang out. Silas froze, his eyes widening. Eleanor, standing on the porch, held her rifle steady, a cloud of smoke rising from the barrel. The shot was a warning, a deliberate miss, but the message was clear. She wasn't afraid. "Get off our land," she said, her voice a low and menacing growl. Silas, a coward at heart, knew when he was beaten. He scowled, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and fear. "This isn't over," he snarled, as he and his men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. After Silas's retreat, an unspoken feeling hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in the fire of shared danger. The trust between them had deepened. transforming from a practical alliance into a true partnership. The town, a quiet place where news traveled fast, had heard of the confrontation. The next day, a few of the ranchers from the neighboring farms came to the ranch offering their help. The man whose son they had saved, Billy's father, was among them. "We heard what happened," he said. "Silas is a troublemaker. You two stood your ground. We'd be honored to help you. It's what neighbors do." Ethan, touched by their kindness, accepted their offer. They worked together, mending the fences, repairing the barn, their collective labor a testament to the strength of community. As they worked, Ethan watched Eleanor. He saw the way she interacted with the other ranchers, her quiet strength and competence earning her their respect. She was not just Arthur's ward. She was a true woman of the West, a cornerstone of their small community. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat on the porch, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear over the mountains. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice quiet. "For everything. For staying. For fighting with me." Eleanor turned to him, her green eyes filled with a softness he had never seen before. "You're a good man, Ethan," she said, her voice a gentle whisper. "You could have walked away. You could have left me to face this alone. But you didn't." He realized then that this was not just about the ranch or the will. It was about something deeper. He had come to the West a stranger, but he was leaving a part of himself here. The next morning, Ethan found Eleanor in the barn, a determined look on her face. "There's something I need to show you," she said. She led him to a small hidden room in the back of the barn, a place he had never seen before. She opened a locked chest, its hinges creaking with age. Inside, nestled among old tools and dusty blankets, was a small, worn-out ledger. "This was David's," she said, "and Arthur's. It's a record of everything, the cattle, the supplies, the profits." Ethan's eyes scanned the pages. The ledger was a meticulous record of the ranch's operations, a testament to the hard work and dedication that had kept the place afloat. But what caught his attention were the last few pages, filled with his uncle's familiar, scrawling handwriting. "He was planning for this," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "He knew he was sick. He was planning for his death. He wrote about you, Ethan. He wrote about his hope that you would come and take over the ranch. He wrote about me. He wanted to make sure I would be cared for." Ethan's eyes welled up with tears as he read the words. Arthur's final entries were not just about business. They were about hope, about legacy, about family. He wrote about his belief that a strong partnership was more than just a legal document. It was the foundation of a good life. "He didn't just want me to care for you," Ethan said, his voice choked with emotion. "He wanted us to care for each other." Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening. "He wanted us to be a family, a new kind of family." The 6-month deadline was fast approaching. Ethan and Eleanor, now more than partners but true friends, sat on the porch watching the sun set, the sky a breathtaking painting of orange and pink. "The lawyer sent a letter," Ethan said, holding up a sealed envelope. "The time is almost up." Eleanor didn't say a word. The silence was thick with unsaid things. "I know this was a strange way for us to meet," Ethan said, his voice a low, earnest whisper. "But I don't feel like a stranger anymore. This ranch, it's my home, and you're a part of it. A part of me now." He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Her hands, rough and calloused from a life of hard work, were the most beautiful things he had ever held. "Eleanor," he said, his heart pounding in his chest, "the will says we have to marry, but I want to. Not for the ranch, not for Arthur, for us, for our future. I want to build a life with you, to make this ranch a true home, to be a real family. She looked at him, her green eyes filled with a mix of surprise, fear, and a slow, beautiful dawning of hope. "I lost one family," she said, her voice a whisper. "I don't know if I can do it again." "You don't have to do it alone," he said, squeezing her hand. "We can do it together. I'll be here, always." Eleanor's lips trembled. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she didn't try to stop it. It was a tear of release, of sorrow for the past and hope for the future. "Yes," she said, the word barely audible. "Yes, Ethan, I will." The wedding was a simple affair, held in the town church. The few ranchers they had befriended, their families, and the town's elderly priest were their guests. Eleanor wore a simple dress, and Ethan wore his best suit. They stood side by side, their hands clasped, their eyes meeting in a silent promise. After the ceremony, they returned to the ranch, their home. The house, which had once felt so empty, was now filled with a new kind of warmth. It was their home now. A week passed, a week of a quiet, unassuming happiness. They worked together side by side, their lives intertwining with the rhythm of the ranch. The future felt bright, a canvas waiting to be painted, but the past had a way of refusing to be buried. Silas Reed, a man whose pride was as vast as the plains, was not one to forget an insult. He'd been quietly working to turn the town against them, spreading rumors about Ethan's city past and Eleanor's unconventional life. One afternoon, as Ethan and Eleanor were riding to town to buy supplies, they were met by a hostile reception. The storekeeper, a man who had been friendly just a week ago, was cold and distant. A few of the townspeople, their faces filled with suspicion, stared at them. Ethan, confused, asked the storekeeper, "What's wrong?" "Silas has been talking," the storekeeper said, his voice low. "He says you stole that ranch, boy. He says you're not a real rancher. He says you're here to sell it off to some big corporation." The words were like a physical blow. The ranch, their home, was a point of contention. The peaceful life they had worked so hard to build was under threat. Eleanor, her face pale, looked at Ethan. "He's trying to make us outcasts," she whispered. "He's trying to turn the town against us." Ethan and Eleanor knew they couldn't fight Silas with fists. He was a force of gossip and manipulation, a shadow that had to be exposed to the light. They decided to call a town meeting, a forum where they could tell their story, their truth. The meeting was held in the town hall, a small, dusty building filled with the townspeople, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Silas stood in a corner, a triumphant smile on his face, ready to pounce. Ethan, a man who had been a clerk just months ago, stood at the front of the room, his voice surprisingly steady. He told them the story of the will, of his arrival, of Eleanor's strength, and of the bond that had formed between them. He spoke of the ranch, not as a piece of property, but as a living entity, a place that held the spirit of his uncle and the heart of Eleanor. Then Eleanor stepped forward. She held the worn-out ledger in her hands. She spoke of her husband, of his love for the ranch, of his trust in Arthur. She spoke of Arthur's care for her and his final wish for her to have a good life. She read the last entry in the ledger, the one where Arthur wrote about his hope for a new beginning for both of them. The room was silent. The townspeople, who had been listening with skepticism, were now touched by her words, her honesty, and her raw emotion. Then a voice from the back of the room spoke up. It was Billy's father. "I was there when they saved my boy," he said. "They worked together. They saved him. That's not what a man who wants to sell his land does. That's what a good neighbor does. That's what a real rancher does." A few more voices, a few of the men who had helped them, stood up and spoke in their defense. The tide was turning. Silas, seeing his plan crumble, lashed out. "You're a liar," he snarled, pointing at Ethan. "You're a city boy with a fancy suit. You'll sell this land and leave us all for dead." Ethan, his voice calm and steady, met his gaze. I'm a man who came here and found a purpose. I'm a man who learned what family means. I'm a man who found a home. And I'm a man who found a woman who taught me what it means to be strong. This isn't just a ranch to me, Silas. This is my life, and I'll fight for it with everything I've got. The townspeople, looking at Ethan and Eleanor standing side by side, their faces filled with a quiet dignity, knew the truth. They saw two people who had found love and purpose in the face of a challenge. They saw a new kind of family, a new kind of strength. Silas, a man alone, knew he was defeated. He left the town hall, his head bowed, his reputation in tatters. The next day, Ethan and Eleanor rode out to the pasture, their hands clasped. The sun was a warm caress on their skin. The wind, which had once felt so lonely, now felt like a gentle whisper, a voice from the past, a promise for the future. The ranch was not just a plot of land anymore. It was a testament to love, to courage, to resilience. It was a place where a city boy found his home and a broken woman found her hope. It was a place where a strange will gave birth to a beautiful, real-life fairy tale.